Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Temple Institute Parsha class. My name is Gedalia Meyer, and I'm podcasting from Ma'ale Adumim in Israel. One of the more popular catchphrases in books or speeches warning others of some impending disaster is, quote, "Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it." It is an interesting phrase, and it certainly sounds convincing. It evokes, in an odd way, the power of fate, that we subject ourselves to a certain fate by not learning the lessons of what happened in the past. In a sense, it claims that we seal our own fate by ignorance, a lesson that is both fascinating and obvious. While this phrase is clearly catchy, nobody knows if it is actually true. It was never meant to be taken as the equivalent of a law of nature or even as a fact of human nature. It was always understood as simply a way of making a point. It attempts to convince someone or some group that they must change their course of action, or else they will suffer the same fate as somebody who came before. Is this really the case? While it may prove true in certain situations, there is probably an almost equal chance that it won't prove true in others. We all recognize that this warning is something that should be heeded. Nobody wants to be doomed to anything, let alone to some failure of the past. So we have learned to take this warning to heart, especially if it doesn't require all that much of a change in our lifestyles. The converse of this warning, that those who do learn from the past are not doomed to repeat it, is also taken as true and worth abiding by. But as personal and national histories have shown countless times, this has proven to be equally unreliable. Sometimes things just don't work out the way that we want, no matter how much we try to make them so. Fate is sometimes like those shopping carts that just go in a certain direction, regardless of which way we push them. In fact, that seems to be the very definition of fate. The actual quote was penned by the European philosopher George Santayana at the beginning of the 20th century. In its original form, it read, quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." The variant with doomed strikes most people as more ominous and catchy. It is likely that this very observation was said many times before him. It is possible that some form of it has existed since ancient times. It is not all that difficult to notice something like this. It is highly unlikely that the ancient Greeks didn't have something like this in their vast repertoire of wisdom. It is certainly not out of the question that the ancient Egyptians, thousands of years before the Greeks, knew of this great advice. Perhaps it goes back to prehistoric times when people said things without writing them down. To find something like this in the Bible is not particularly hard. There are so many quotes from the Bible that some variant of almost everything can be found there. There are many examples of warnings to look back to the past to learn some lesson. There are an almost equal number of warnings about ignorance, willful or otherwise, condemning the Israelites to a certain fate. In a sense, this could be said to be the core moral lesson of the Bible as a whole, to learn from the past so as not to repeat the same mistakes. Judaism in general is replete with this lesson. There are so many customs and stories that remind Jews of what happened in the past, all with the underlying understanding that this is something that could or should happen again if we play our cards right or wrong. Judaism is a religion which lives to a great degree in the past. Discussing things that happened 3,000 years ago is like talking about yesterday's news to a bunch of Jews going over their basics. It is embedded in the religion, and Jews, for the most part, aren't looking to change that way of doing things. This week's Parsha is called Bo. It is a short word for a Parsha that is about as filled with world-defining events as any other. This is the Parsha of the Exodus. The entire story takes place right smack in the middle of this Parsha. It may be a bit hard to believe that what might be the most famous event in human history is all contained in this single Parsha, but it is true nevertheless. The Parsha begins with the last 3 of the 10 plagues. While the plagues are certainly a prelude to the Exodus, they are not the Exodus itself. The final 3 plagues are locusts, darkness, and the killing of the firstborn. The first 2 of these were like the previous 7. They put a great scare into Pharaoh and forced him to almost capitulate, but in the end, accomplished little of permanence. At least with the locusts, Pharaoh was forced to admit that he had sinned against God in his obstinance. He begged Moshe and Aaron to pray to God to remove the locusts, but he never agreed to actually submit to the explicit demands of releasing the Israelites from oppression, and certainly never considered letting them leave. With the darkness, things got even worse for Pharaoh. He went so far as to allow the Israelites to leave and worship God as long as they left their sheep and cattle behind. He obviously wanted some sort of insurance policy that they would return. When Moshe demanded that Pharaoh must supply them with animals for the required sacrificial offerings to God, or else that they should be able to bring their own animals with them, all negotiations came to a halt. This was another classic case of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, and things went back to square one. The final plague, the killing of the firstborn, was given with the warning that it would work and that all of Pharaoh's servants would come to Moshe and demand that the Israelites leave. But God also told Moshe that Pharaoh would not listen to this warning, thus enabling the final plague to come to fruition. So the stage was set for this final plague to bring about the fated and openly predicted exodus from Egypt. The actual setting for the night of the exodus takes up the middle portion of the Parsha. This has become the foundation for the national holiday of Passover or Pesach. The basic laws of the Pesach meal and the ceremony surrounding it are described in great detail. The first Pesach, however, was not a commemorative celebration like all future Passover meals. This was the real thing, the event that all those future Passovers would commemorate. It included setting aside a lamb or goat to be eaten that night while all the drama was going on outside. The Israelites were to put blood from the animal on their doorposts to signify that their house should be spared from the destruction. The Israelites were to be ready to leave at a moment's notice, even while eating the meal. Things were happening very quickly. Included in God's instructions to Moshe about the events of this night are instructions for future generations. This is where the famous commandment to only eat unleavened bread for the 7 days that would encompass the holiday of Passover in the future. This commandment for the future was imposed because during the actual Exodus, things happened so fast that the Israelites didn't have time to bake bread that was allowed to rise. The Passover meals of the future were thus a way to relive the actual event. Important as all this is, it still wasn't the actual Exodus. That great event, surprisingly, is described so briefly that it is almost easy to miss it. It takes a total of 2 verses to describe it. It follows the preliminary verses describing how the plague struck at midnight and people and animals everywhere were dying. Pharaoh finally relents and tells Moshe to take all the Israelites along with their animals and leave. The people took their unrisen dough on their backs and requested gold and silver from their Egyptian former neighbors. After this, the Exodus itself finally comes about. Quote, the Israelites traveled from Ramses to Sukkot in a group of about 600,000 men, in addition to children. A great mass of others came with them, and also a great amount of sheep and cattle. That's the entire Exodus, told in 2 short verses. It almost seems a little anticlimactic after all the lead up and the preparations. Of course, there are the great following events coming up, like the crossing of the sea and the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. But as far as the Exodus from Egypt is concerned, it's all there in these 2 verses. We are almost forced to ask the question as to why there is so much buildup to the Exodus, but that the actual event hardly gets any airtime. If this was a movie, there is no question that most of the story would focus on the action of the Exodus and not on all those events that lead up to it. Why does the Torah do the exact opposite? Why is the Exodus itself described almost as a passing event and not as the bulk of the story? Perhaps the answer to this question is that the Torah is attempting to practice that preaching of remembering and learning from the past to avoid the fate of repeating it. The actual event of the Exodus, as dramatic and as action-packed as it must have been, was not the lesson to be learned. It was a big deal, of that there is no doubt, but it wasn't the main point. It was the inevitable conclusion of all that had led up to it, but it was really nothing more than destiny playing out the final cards of its hand. The real lesson was contained in that buildup. We could wonder why God felt it necessary to tell Moshe all those details about how future generations of Israelites and Jews were to celebrate the Passover ceremony. Shouldn't Moshe have asked God why he needed to know all this now, when it could wait until all the drama was over? But that would have missed the entire point. It wasn't the drama that was the real event taking place. It was the preparation for always commemorating this event so as to never forget what had happened. The unleavened bread, the matzah, seems like a fairly trivial point for God to command. So they didn't have time to bake their bread after allowing it to rise. Who cares? But this is also the way to remember this event and to always keep it fresh in the collective national mind. Otherwise, history would come back to bite them in the face. This perhaps is the primary lesson of the Exodus, to remember what happened so as to serve as a guide for the future. Fate can be brutal, and history is filled with disasters and catastrophes. The Israelites and the Jews have had more than their fair share of these, but they have this weapon in their arsenal to enable them to handle whatever fate throws at them. They remember and learn from their past, and thus are able to face the present and the future. Shabbat Shalom.